Hello and welcome to week 4 of HOS 121. This week we look at one of our themes for this subject, which is about attachments and relationships. And this first lecture looks at the theory of attachment. So the theory of attachment is really a theory of relationships, and I and many others would say that attachment theory is probably the most important theory of human development. And you may see the proof of this in your own life as I talk about attachment theory. You might think back to how your early relationships influenced your development and how these influences continue to play out in your development even today. So this first lecture for the week looks at what is attachment and why is it important, and then we'll look at how the theory of attachment evolved over the 20th century and different key thinkers and researchers in attachment theory. Before we do that, I just want to remind you about what is a theory. So you may recall from the second lecture of week 2, the Theories of Human Development lecture, and also from your reading, that a theory is defined as a set of ideas that are proposed to describe and explain certain phenomena, which in this case is human development, and that a good theory is internally consistent, and that means that different parts of the theory can't contradict themselves. So one part of the theory has to kind of fit with the other. It has to be falsifiable, so that means that it should generate hypotheses that then can be tested with research. And then also a good theory should be supported by data, so that research evidence should support the tenets of that theory. And attachment theory really meets all of these requirements. So we'll see that you can make hypotheses about what would result if there is problems in the attachment relationship, that you might then think there'll be other issues down the line, or that might affect children's ability to self-regulate. And there's also a lot of evidence to support attachment theory. So attachment theory really demonstrates the qualities of a good theory. Now let's define attachment and look at why it's important. So what is attachment? Attachment is a theory of how humans develop the capacity to form and maintain emotional relationships, and how those relationships influence our development and our sense of self. So your reading defines attachment as an affectional tie that binds a person to an intimate companion, which is an attachment figure. In early life, attachment figures are typically parents, but over the course of development and different developmental periods, attachments can also form between two friends or romantic partners or other relationships, including the attachment a parent feels for their own child. Children learn how to regulate their behavior through the attachment relationship. And we'll come back to this. The attachment figure provides security and a safe base for exploration. So your book gives the example of baby Ethan. He tries to stay close to his mom, and he follows her around, and he cries if she leaves or doesn't pick him up. And he's particularly affectionate and smiley with her. And when she's nearby, Ethan feels comfortable exploring his environment because he knows he can run to her if he needs some kind of support. And that's the idea of the safe base. Because the attachment relationship is a profound connection, losing that connection is a major threat. And so it can even feel like a threat to survival. So children get very distressed often when they separate from an attachment figure. And if they lose attachment figure, then they would experience really profound distress. And that's can be echoed in other periods of our lives with other attachment figures as well. If you have the relationship, or if someone becomes widowed, there again can be that feeling of distress and loss from an important relationship. Take a minute to think of an important attachment figure from your early childhood. Maybe it's your mom or your dad or your grandparent or another caregiver. So think about that person as we talk about attachment. So how did that relationship relate to the aspects of the theory of attachment that we're going to discuss? And you're going to have an opportunity to reflect on attachment and your important relationships in Assessment 1B. So now back to why attachment is important. So there's evidence, and the person who formulated the theory of attachment, as we'll get to in a minute, argued that attachment is important for the survival of the human species. So you can think about this for a minute. A baby comes into the world completely helpless and dependent on adults to meet his or her survival needs. So how is it that a baby ensures that their needs are met by that adult caregiver? So babies have many types of behaviors that they do. And John Bowlby, who formulated the theory of attachment, argued that infants and their parents are biologically predisposed to form an attachment relationship. That children, come out of the womb prepared to form relationships with their caregivers, and that they have natural attachment behaviors like crying, smiling, clinging, sucking, things that responses from their primary caregivers. And Bowlby, who we'll return to, made the point that we've evolved those behaviors because they've contributed to human survival. So unlike other species, like you think of a newborn horse, they come out in the world and they can walk on their own and they can sort of manage for themselves, and many other animal species. Humans need caregivers to meet their basic needs for food and shelter and comfort. And without the attachment between the caregiver and the infant would not be able to thrive on his or her own. So we see attachment behaviors in other species, which points to its value of survival. And the human infant is, compared to other animals, particularly vulnerable. So attachment is profoundly important in terms of the survival of the human species. And attachment is also important because it describes how we come to think of ourselves. It relates to how we develop our sense of the world and understanding of ourselves in the world. And we develop that from the attachment relationship. And this understanding stays with us as something that we'll come to know as the internal working model. We'll return to that idea later in the lecture. So when an infant has someone who meets his or her needs promptly, when he or she cries, the infant learns that others are responsive and that they can get their needs met. And when there's an inconsistent or problematic pattern of interaction, the infant learns another message, which is that their needs don't matter. So the experience of the attachment relationship influences emotional development. So infants and young children look to their attachment figures to understand the world and how they should respond. And this is called social referencing. So when something happens, the baby or the young child will look to the attachment figure to see how he or she reacts. Maybe someone knocks on the door and the child hums behind their dad and waits to see how he reacts. Is this a friend or a foe? And that helps the child understand the social context and develop more complex emotions like empathy and pride, guilt or shame. So children really start to develop their emotions and regulate their emotions through the relationship with the attachment figure. So again, we see that through young children in their exploration. So children begin to develop, to explore their environments, and they manage their fear of situation by looking to the attachment figure for their reactions in a new situation like a playground. And when they see that the parent is not worried, then they know that this is a safe space to explore. So as we mentioned in the discussion in the lectures and reading about socialization, attachment is the foundation of socialization. So socialization is most powerful when it comes from people to whom children feel an attachment. And so, of course, parents are profoundly important in socialization, and other figures to whom a child forms a connection, like peers or like teachers or like a relative, can also be very important figures in terms of socializing children. So attachment figures, for example, they model emotions, how you react to a situation, and then children are imitating, through the observational method of socialization in terms of their early learning around emotions. And parents respond selectively to emotions and they react certain ones. So you don't need to be afraid, or you should be afraid, for example. And that's the behavioral method of socialization. So this topic of attachment very closely links in with our previous topic of socialization. Attachment, this theory of relationships, evolved over the course of the 20th century due to the thinking of a number of different key figures. And so, it could seem when you read a theory in a book that it all emerged at once, but actually this theory, like many other theories, evolved gradually through the contributions of many thinkers. So we're going to now trace the evolution of attachment theory and how it evolved from its early origins into the theory that we know today. Some of the influences on the development of attachment theory came from research with animals. So in the 1930s, the Austrian zoologist who's pictured here, his name is Konrad Lorenz, conducted an experiment where he divided two sets of live goose eggs and left one set with their mother and hatched another in an incubator. And when the set of the eggs in the incubator hatched, in the absence of their mother, and in the presence of Conrad Lorenz, they imprinted on Lorenz. And then he took the two set of baby geese, the one that had been, been with their mothers, and the other that had been in the incubator, and he observed what happened. So the ones that were first exposed to their mother gravitated towards her, while the ones that were first exposed to Lorenz gravitated towards him and followed him around, as you can see in this picture. So this idea of imprinting, which comes from some animals, like these geese, shows that there's some biological basis for attachment. So it's called imprinting in geese, and in humans, we're hardwired for attachment, though it looks different. The process isn't that there's a critical period right at the beginning that you kind of imprint onto a particular figure and that's it. There's more resiliency in human beings, and sometimes if those attachment relationships are disrupted, a child can be adopted by another family or go to a foster family. But there's something about imprinting that suggests that there is a particular time, and it's called a sensitive period, when process like attachment is meant to form. And so that relates to how the theory of attachment was developed, recognizing from these types of experiments with animals that there's a biological tendency towards attachment to a particular figure who will look after the baby, in this case the geese, and that's meant to occur during a sensitive period where the child is particularly primed to make that emotional connection. Another influence on the development of attachment theory came from research by Rene Spitz and others during the 1940s, which showed systematically how social interactions with other humans is essential for the development of young children. So Spitz followed two groups of children. He followed two cohorts of children from the time they were born until the time they were several years old. So this is a longitudinal study. And the first group was raised in an orphanage where the babies were more or less cut off from human contact and were in cribs most of the time, or where they had a single nurse for several children. And then the second group was raised in a nursery in a prison where their mother was incarcerated, but the mothers were able to give care and affection to their babies every day, and the babies were able to see each other and the prison staff during the day. So at age 4 months, the development of the two groups of babies was similar, and the babies in the orphanage even scored higher on certain average tests. But by the time the babies were 1 year old, the motor and intellectual performance of those who were reared in the orphanage lagged badly behind those in the prison nursery. And the orphanage babies were also less curious, less playful, and more subject to infections. And then by the second and third year of life, the children being raised by the mothers in prison could walk and talk more confidently and showed development that was more comparable and similar to those to babies that were born and raised in typical family settings. But of the children raised in the orphanages, only 2 could walk and manage a few words. So there were major delays observed in the development of the children in the orphanage, who again were mostly in their cribs. And since that time of Spitz's work, there have been many other experiments that have shown what a catastrophic effect that sensory and social deprivation has on early childhood. So it's when children are raised in conditions in orphanages where they're not getting a lot of social interaction. So really this research has shown the importance of emotional connections with attachment figures early in life, and how those relationships help children to develop in terms of their sensory development, their cognitive development, and their physical development. So inspired by the work of Rene Spitz and others who looked at what the effects are of maternal deprivation, Harry Harlow did a series of experiments on the effects of separation and deprivation in infant rhesus monkeys. So you see here a monkey. So there was a series of experiments that separated newborn rhesus monkeys from their birth mothers and put them with surrogate mothers like the ones that you can see on the left. One would be an iron figure that would have a bottle in it, which was referred to as the Iron Maiden. So they held a bottle that the infant monkey could obtain nourishment from. And then the other surrogate mother that was in the same cage was covered in a soft terry cloth. It was a wire monkey with a soft terry cloth. And Harlow found that while the infant monkeys would go to the wire mother to obtain food, they spent most of their days clinging to the soft cloth mother. And when they were frightened, they would be frightened intentionally by Harlow. He would do a sharp sound, and the baby monkeys would run to their cloth-covered mother for security and for comfort. And so, these studies have been used to show that it's not that attachment forms from a classical conditioning, like we talked about in week 2, where an attachment is formed simply on the basis of who provides food. There was a lot of theory around this time, the 1950s and 60s, that would be the basis of attachment. You provide food, and that food is associated with a caregiver, and that's actually what the attachment is. Like Pavlov's dog, it's, you provide some kind of a stimulus and so food and an attachment figure, but it's really food that is causing the relationship. And Harlow's studies showed that it's really comfort that is the crucial element of attachment. It's the feeling of receiving comfort and care from a caregiver that is the critical piece in terms of attachment. John Bowlby, who's a British psychoanalyst, is credited as the founder of attachment theory, and he was influenced by the research of Lorenz on animal imprinting, and Spitz on maternal deprivation of children in orphanages, and Harlow in terms of the idea of contact comfort and what happens when infant rhesus monkeys are separated from their mothers. And he brought a lot of those influences together in developing attachment theory. So he was a psychoanalyst, and the children were brought to him as infant problems, quote unquote, and that he noticed that these children tended to react in different ways to their caregivers. And he also noticed that the ways that their caregivers treated them and interacted with them was linked to different anxiety levels. So he noticed that most children, particularly very young children, got very distressed if their caregiver went away, although some were completely indifferent. And likewise, there was different reactions from the children when their caregivers came back. So Bowlby's insight was to suggest that there were different attachment styles, different ways of connecting to other people that infants learned through their interactions with their caregivers. So according to Bowlby's formulation of attachment theory, infants are born with an evolutionary need to form a close connection to primary caregivers. And the idea, as I mentioned before, is that that attachment provokes the survival of human species. So it's a hardwired type of behavior that comes from nature, and babies come into the world with certain ways of trying to elicit a response from their caregivers. And when their caregivers are not consistently accessible and responsive to their needs, human infants can form secure attachments and develop a secure sense of themselves and of the world from that relationship, from that consistency of having their needs met. And that consistency of having their needs met allows securely attached children to use the primary caregiver as a secure base to explore the world. And the idea is that if they don't get that kind of response back, then children start to form different types of attachments with their parents, which we'll come to. And the attachment relationship with the caregivers leads to the development of an internal working model. So this is the child's cognitive framework in terms of their mental representations for understanding the world. As a pattern forms over time, either the child gets their need met consistently by the caregiver or not, they come to expect to be treated that way by the world. So that's how early relationships can stay with us in terms of forming an early idea of how the world is going to treat us, an early expectation of that. And I'm going to elaborate on that point. These are some of the core characteristics of attachment as Bowlby described them. So the child tries to maintain proximity to the attachment figure. They want to stay close to the attachment figure. They're trying to remain connected to that figure who's ensuring their survival, and uses that figure as a safe haven, so that secure base. So a person to go to in times of distress and a source of safety and comfort when that's needed. and there's a sense of distress when there's separation from the attachment figure. So this is a basic visual depiction of how attachment forms. So a baby has a need. So that might be that the baby's cold or hungry, or something comes up, and then the baby cries, and then there's a response from the caregiver. And if that need is consistently met, then the baby develops trust that the caregiver is there to meet that child's needs. That becomes internalized as an internal working model of how relationships are meant to work, so that there's, when the child's needs are consistently met, the child experiences a feeling of security and understanding. According to Bowlby, the relationship with the primary caregiver becomes the prototype for future relationships via this internal working model. And that internal working model is developed over time through that cycle I just showed you, that either there is consistency in terms of getting one's needs met, or there's not. So, and the child develops a sense of others being trustworthy, the self being valued, and the self being as effective in terms of getting its needs met. Or if they get their needs consistently met. Or the child can develop an insecure attachment type and have an internal working model that perceives themselves and their environment as negative or as untrustworthy. And that would include beliefs around others as being unreliable and the self as unworthy of care. So that would be when children's needs are not met, they can start to develop these internal messages, which are not necessarily conscious messages, but not getting those needs met creates those feelings of I'm unlovable, I'm unworthy, and others are not available to me, others are rejecting. And so these are the kinds of models that we can carry forward with us into our relationships unconsciously, because all of this happens at a very early age in our sort of subconscious. And the last person I'll mention in this theory, who contributed to the development of attachment theory, although there have been others after her, is Mary Ainsworth, who was a student of Bowlby's, and in the 1970s developed something called the strange situation, which we're going to come back to, which was basically taking Bowlby's theory and making it testable. So she developed a research condition under which researchers could observe different attachment behaviors, and she also identified different types of attachment. And that's what we'll talk about in the next lecture. So we'll stop here, and we'll pick up the next lecture to talk about different attachment types.